Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Amir Grinstein, Associate Professor of Marketing at Northeastern University's D. Moore McKim School of Business, as our esteemed guest on the podcast. Dr. Amir's research and teaching focuses on intersection of marketing and society, with particular emphasis on social and environmental contexts such as promoting green and healthy behaviors and evaluating the effectiveness of brand activism. He also co-founded and serves on the board of 50/50 Startup, a non-profit tech accelerator, and holds key editorial positions with leading journals, including the International Journal of Research in Marketing, Journal of Marketing, Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, and Journal of International Marketing. Dr. Grinstein earned his postdoctoral fellowship from the marketing department at Harvard Business School. He holds a PhD in marketing, an MBA with a specialization in marketing, and a BA in business and economics, all from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. In today's episode, Dr. Amir shares insights from his research, creating social change by moving from I level to G level and S level interventions, which presents a framework linking individual, group, and system-wide change. The study highlights how consumers act as an active change agents with a broader system and introduces innovative methods, coordination games, and agent-based modeling to study group-level transformation. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amir Grinstein to the conversation. Dr. Amir, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak, very much. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Professor, what inspired you to explore the connection between individual level interventions and system level change in your research?
Well, we realized that we are all in the pursuit of and all interested in, improving the world, improving society, improving the environment. And this is a tall task, right? It's very hard to do. And in the last, 50 years, a lot of interventions and policies, and whether it's coming from the private sector or the governmental sector or the nonprofit sector, we try to move forward with solving, significant social problems. And sometimes we make progress, and sometimes it feels it's too daunting, and we're not able to solve, big issues like, climate crisis and poverty and inequality and things like that. And what I think we realized in the last few years is that a lot of attention as scholars, as marketers, has been directed to trying to convince the individual consumer to change their mind, to change their behavior, right? To make them more environmental or more responsible, to make the right decision or the more ethical decisions, etc. And while it, of course, can be useful to have people, maybe consume less or consume more responsibly or being more thoughtful about their decision-making process, etc., it has clearly not enabled us to make meaningful progress towards solving all these big problems, social and environment, etc. So I think we realized a few years ago that we need to kind of change our perspective and see if we could move some of the efforts and attention and intervention from the eye level, so focusing only on the individual, putting all the pressure and all the responsibility on the individual, to a broader perspective that suggests individuals are part of the story, but we need a coalition of other partners and a coalition of other activities to come together to make a change. And one of the, I want to look for the correct citation, but there was a 2022 paper that was really, I think, 2023 paper by two co-authors, Chatter and Lowenstein, that for the first time in recent years kind of said, the eye level perspective, it's not enough. We have to do something else. And I think that was a very impactful. Sometimes, we as researchers, we are caught up in our own ivory towers, but I think, and our impact maybe sometimes is limited. I think that article was actually very impactful because it led to, a wave of new thinking about maybe we should not desert the eye level, the individual level thinking, but but it's not as optimal as maybe we hoped for it to be. And we need to think in what can we do to create system level, S level change. And I think this is where we are, where this is the dilemma, how to move from focusing only on the consumers or the individuals um, to a broader perspective that would enable a bigger, wider change.
Professor, could you explain the core idea behind your framework based on complexity theory and how it helps researchers understand societal change?
So we published together, I published a paper in 2025 with two fantastic colleagues from the Netherlands, Jan Willem Bolderdijk, always complicated name, Jan Willem, and Hans Rieselada. And we started to think about how we can move the field forward in, emphasizing what can we do as consumer researchers to enable a mindset shift and also maybe methodological shift to consumer researchers who wants to study system level change or to move from a focus only on individual level change. And the first part of this project was about creating a conceptual framework that, again, shed light on some elements of thinking that are not typically there when you are only studying the individual consumers. Again, this is not necessarily a criticism of the folks who study individual consumers, and I for a long time and still is studying individual consumers. It's fascinating, it's interesting, it's important. It's just if we want to move forward in creating a long-lasting, wider change, we need to bring this kind of new mindset to the table and at least start discussing this and see how we can, explore um, this move from individual to kind of societal system level change. And we thought about three components that we need to account for. First of all, this idea that individual consumers are part of a wider network of decision makers and the environment, right? So again, when we think about individual level interventions, we think about how do I convince Amir or how do I convince Deepak to, eat less meat or drive a hybrid car or do something that is useful for the environment, for the society, etc. And in this case, you really focus on how can I convince Amir or Deepak? What are their motivations and barriers and story, and what could help them change their mind um, and their behavior. When you start to think about individual consumers as part of a wider system, then you are connecting different influencers and different situation in which consumers have influence on others. Um, and it's not just focusing on the marketer versus the individual, but there are, family members, and there are retail chains, and there's the government with their policies, and there's the environment where you see things, you see how others are behaving. So it's a conceptual mindset that suggests, you know what, you're not alone in your decision making, an individual consumer. You're part of a system. And so emphasizing this, and this is coming from complexity theory that appreciate this kind of mindset. So that was the kind of the one component. The second component was, and I think this is really meaningful, is the fact that we typically studied individuals and their behavioral change, and we were satisfied by the fact that an individual or group of individuals changed their mindset or behavior following an intervention. That was the goal. Let's have Amir eat less meat. I'm running, I don't know, campaigns about this. I'm changing the policy. And then Amir and a group of others maybe are reducing their meat consumption. Maybe it's good for their health. Maybe it's good for the environment. Great. We're satisfied. As researchers, we brought an intervention. We showed that it's effective. Great. I think the second element of our framework that is really important is the view that consumers are not only passive in the process. They're not only getting information and deciding to change their mind maybe or change their behavior, but they're active. They can be, and it's hard. They can be active change agents. So now that I maybe changed my mind about meat consumption, the question is, can I now start a conversation with others and maybe convince them? Or maybe others now see me eat less meat and now can be influenced. So it's this idea that consumers that have typically been viewed as really passive agents of information, getting information and changing or not changing their behavior. This is super important to see them as potential agents of change in social media, in the environment, um, having conversation peer to peer with others, putting pressure or trying to convince other entities in the environment. So I think this is the second element and super important. And the final piece of this kind of new thinking is, many of the studies in the field of consumer research and that use experiments are what we call cross-sectional in nature. So we run a study, we compare between groups, we do it today, we do it now, people are responding, and our results hold for the specific experiment at a certain point in time. And we generate insights from that, and it's great. Um, it's a very effective method, running experiments or surveys. But it's like at this moment in time, this is what we got from the study. These are the insights, and that's it. The new kind of way of thinking about this, making a meaningful change, is that you want to see change over time, and you want to see the dynamics of that change. And I think this is another pretty meaningful aspect because sometimes if you only look at the cross-sectional results, then you might not get the full picture. Well, if you adopt kind of the dynamics, the feedback loop that we call in the paper, this idea that consumers maybe react to a message that they saw online, they change their behavior, but then, maybe others saw them, then, would that impact others' behavior? Would other behaviors now impact the consumer? So we need to see things change over time. So this completely changes the way we think about designing experiments. Now you have to think about not as a single individual in a single point in time that is not expected to convince or be influenced by others, but rather longitudinal, long-term kind of design with dynamics embedded in the story and viewing consumers as actors that can, shift their behavior over time in different ways and influence others and being influenced by other actors. So it's a pretty it's a more nuanced and maybe a little bit more complicated kind of mindset, but it's probably and there might be other, actors or conceptual dimensions that are out there are part of the story. We thought these three dimensions are meaningful, and we started there.
Professor, how do you define consumers as active change agents in the wider system rather than passive participants in markets?
Right. This is really, I think, you're focusing on a core element of this framework because again, we tended and to a large extent, the wide consumer research community is focusing on individual as a passive actor. We get information and then we change or not our mind and behavior. Um, which, by the way, we looked at the two leading consumer research journals, which is Journal of Consumer Research and Journal of Consumer Psychology, and really, you know, the vast majority of articles in the last 5 years, even you say. So I'm not looking 20 or 30 years back, but just like the most recent publications are very much looking at individual consumers, um, and how they, make decisions and maybe change behavior. Another aspect of that many of these studies are not actually thinking about social issues. I don't know if it's surprising or not. It was a little bit surprising to me. Still, most of the work is about, I would say, commercial related context, right? So about consumptions and things like that. So going back to your point, so almost everybody's focused on consumers in non-pro-social context and view them as individual consumers, and kind of as passive actors. What we are suggesting is that there's much more. So an individual is much more than a consumer, right? So they can be a consumer. It can be a consumer that, shape others' behavior. They could be a consumer that change their mind over time. Um, but they could be also, they're also citizens in a municipality, and they're part of that ecosystem and can have an influence there. They are voters and they can, participate in that process. In our framework, let me pick it up for a second for you. Um, they could be, of course, employees in an organization. They could be um, activists, so really leading the way in how they think about a topic, care about a topic. I go to demonstrations, etc., being on social media, voice your opinion, etc., boycott, etc. So it's really a multi-dimensional, multifaceted view of consumers, which when you adopt such an approach, then the consumer hat is only as somebody who consumes, buys and consumes kind of seems pretty limited. Again, it's pretty central to individual life, modern life. In many countries, materialism, consumption are central to who we are, to our identity, to how people judge and evaluate us. So I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying it's one hat, it's one dimension, and it's worthwhile to view individuals in the context of social issues much more broadly than the consumer side.
Professor, feedback loops seems central to your framework. How can researchers or policymakers identify and leverage these loops effectively over time?
Yeah, so the idea of feedback loops, first of all, to just the notion that we include or integrate in our modeling, in our thinking, feedback loops, I think are important. And again, feedback loops from the complexity, complex system, complex theories, is this idea that um, behaviors are probably most of the time are dynamic. It's not one and done. We are continue to be influenced by others, and we continue to influence others, and things in our environment change. So there's this dynamic which lead to, for example, if let me give you an example from the research on social change, which I think might be useful here. You think about what requires from a community, from a society to have a meaningful change, a change in norm, for example, right? And there's a bunch of work on this topic that most of the time they used simulations to predict, but the idea was, you have a minority of people that wants change. For example, they want to um, support a certain social change. In the US, we're supporting Black Lives Matter, for example, right? So there's a minority group of we want more people to eat less meat in the environmental space. So you have these goals, these agendas, social agendas, and you have a minority of people that really care, really passionate, maybe, the activist group. And you ask yourself, what would it take to change the minds of the majority? And feedback loops are there to kind of mitigate this process. So for example, if you have this literature found that if you have on average 25% of the people that care about the topic and are voicing their opinion and are activistic and are trying to convince others and talk to policymakers and talk to government officials and talk to marketers, then others in the majority that maybe care less about the topic, they start to see it around them and they start to maybe rethink about this, right? Oh, okay. I didn't realize this person cares about this issue. This issue, yeah, maybe it's interesting, let me think about it, let me learn more about it, etc. And that the 15, 20, 25% minority gradually increases because of that. And this is part of the feedback loop. Then, at a certain moment, which we call, or this literature called tipping point, at a certain moment, um, there's enough people around that start to care about this topic, and they are starting almost to shift the norm, or the starting the process of shifting the norm. Then the feedback loop continue to kick in, and you start to see institutions that are looking around and say, it could be politicians, it could be brands. They look around and say, the public, there used to be 10% that cared about this. Yeah, then as an institution, company, or an elected official, a prospective politician, I didn't talk about this because I thought nobody cares about it. But suddenly, it's not 20%, it's not 50%, it's not 7%, it's 40% that care about these issues. Maybe it's now even 51, but you don't have to be actually a real majority. It has to be enough, um, a loud, active group of people that care about a topic, and suddenly the change come with the public, and suddenly, gradually, the institution look at it and say, okay, now I have a stake in this. Now it's worth my time to focus on this issue, and then politicians change the policy, and then brands change their behavior. So a new norm is basically um, is being kind of established. So this is the process, and it's all about these feedback loops that you start with a minority group. in the society that cares about the topic, and then some others around them, and then some others, and then maybe the majority, and then the institutions, and then it's become the new norm. And it's all about the feedback loops. I would say another thing from at least a researcher standpoint, um, and maybe we'll talk about methods that are relevant for that later, but one element at least that seem to be important is to create or design studies that are operating over time, which then, at least in theory, could bring um, to the data, to the analysis, elements of these feedback loops and dynamics.
Professor, how do methods such as coordination games and agent-based modeling, which are central to the theme, add depth and clarity to traditional consumer research approaches?
Yeah, so my colleagues who are the experts on the topic led this part of the article. So I would be kind of, I would say, more brief or general in how I talk about these methods. The general principle is that, when we are using experiments, often experiments and surveys in our cross-sectional designs, things that are happening now, and we get insights from them at this point in time where the participants are, participating in the studies, they are limited in generating the more complex picture, like with feedback loops and over time, things like that. The idea behind agent-based modeling and coordination games is that they bring, in a lab setting, granted, so this is still controlled environment, a simulation type of activity that you can dial up or dial down the way participants can approach a dilemma. And one of the interesting example we give in the paper is this idea of how the traditional experimentation versus these type of methods, these simulations, are showing different results. And the example is about moral rebels. Moral rebels is, you can imagine these people, and let's go back, the story was about meat consumption. Think about the people that turn into vegetarians, and they're like very, um, they care deeply about the topic, and now they go from a person, from going to different individuals and family members and friends and start to advocate and preach almost about, how can you eat um, meat? And I know you don't have this trouble in India, at least with, certain types of meat, but, in the West, big deal, everybody eat meat, okay. And now a person that stopped eating meat or reduced their consumption of meat now goes to other people and start to preach to them, this is bad for you, it's bad for the environment, it's immoral for, the animal. And what do you think, Deepak, if people are being told that they are, are doing the wrong thing, do you think they like it? Yeah, I guess, they don't. We don't like to be preached at, and it's obviously suggests that these moral rebels, the people that lead the way in doing the right ethical thing, it seems based on all, maybe the intuition, but also experimental work that use cross-sectional, designs, shows that it's not useful, that people are like turning away and are anti whatever the cause is because they're being told that they're not ethical enough. You think about it, these moral rebels put a mirror in front of you, and they let you see that your behavior maybe is not ideal for the animals, for the environment, etc. And you are like, yeah, I don't like to see this image of myself. So I'm like, immediately I turn this off, and these people, they are crazy, they're like whatever, naive, forget about it. I'm not listening. The new approaches, coordination games, the simulations, etc. My colleagues were able, they used these approaches on the same topic, and they were able to show that actually over time, some of the messages from these moral rebels actually kick in. And some people that at the onset of this process were like, yeah, no, 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 I don't like what you're telling me. Thought about it some more, maybe saw some action around them that led them to rethink. And it seems that the idea of moral rebel is more positive to the cause than we initially expected. But only if we can study it over time and to see the loops and to see the dynamics. And this you cannot study with simple experiments, but more with this kind of simulation type of activity. So, um, something to consider when one designs or consider the package of studies in these areas.
Professor, how can marketing researchers and practitioners collaborate to design interventions that move beyond influencing individuals to shaping collective behavior?
So one, I would say, general recommendation would be to develop these almost cross-disciplinary or cross-method type of teams. So for example, I do or typically use one type of method, but my colleagues used a different type of methods, and we could use this together to portray a more holistic um, approach, both methodologically, but also from the result sides. Um, so I would definitely recommend people to be, if you're not versed enough in a certain method, but it seems to make sense for a certain purpose, then definitely, being open to collaborate with others who are expert on the specific method. But more specifically to your question, um, we need to think about interventions that could maybe allow for individual behavior change, but then also have an impact on the collective. And we are now starting at Northeastern um, with the support of a research institute in Germany, Nuremberg Institute for Marketing, and we are thinking about how can we convince individuals, but also not only to change their behavior, but also to convince others. And it seems that overall, when people think about this idea of, convincing others to do the ethical thing, the right thing from a pro-social perspective, it's really hard for them because they don't want to be viewed as those moral rebels, right? Um, I give often this example of documentary that I give to my students that we watching some of it in class. A really powerful documentary. It's called The True Cost, and it's about the hidden cost of fast fashion. And we all, as consumers, really enjoy um, consuming non-costly fashion items, but then we don't ask ourselves, so most of us don't ask ourselves, how come it's so cheap? What's happening with the labor in the factories in Asia, and what are the environmental consequences, etc. So in that respect, the students, the young generation that is like typically very much aware on social and care about social and environmental issues, they're very intrigued by the movie. For many of them, it's something new that they learn and like impacted by. And then I ask them, if you're really impacted or influenced by this, you found this movie, appealing, important, share, talk about it with others. So share with others. And it's very typical that in the following class, I ask, the 40 student class, who shared or talked about it, and you have one hand or two hands that because people don't like, for different reasons, um, that we start to cover in the new research project with the German counterparts and in Northeastern. Um, Different reasons people don't like to do it. They think they'll get into a political fight. They don't win. They don't want to be viewed as um, pretentious and um, morally superior. So they're like, yeah, I don't think I'll share that movie, although it's super important because only through those means other people might get influence, right? So the project and that we are trying to start initiating is how can we convince consumers, what are the, or individual consumers, what are the methods, what are the interventions that would be the most effective in um, allowing us as individuals to talk with others about the same topics. Um, One specific angle that we're kind of looking at is this idea of pluralistic ignorance. So, in fact, when you ask people around them, how many people around you in your, family, friends, people who are close to you, how much the environment, the climate crisis is meaningful to them, important to them. And people are like, probably only a minority. Okay. And then we ask them, and how it's important to you? And then they say, yeah, it's pretty important to us. And there's a gap because then if you go and ask the others are also like, yeah, this is pretty important, Maybe, there's other barriers why we're not acting, but in terms of attitudes and a mindset that cares about this, yeah, we care about. So we are wondering if an intervention that kind of make it very clear that people around you are also caring about these topics, maybe in this case, the climate change, etc., then you will be more willing to share insights about the environment with others. For example, a campaign that wants to, make a certain point, getting more attention, etc. So in short, to your question, how can we make interventions that now, yes, makes the individual change their mind and behavior, but also, and this is super important, and that's the novel part, talk with others, share with others, engage others in the picture.
Professor, from a real-world experience and perspective, how can this framework guide organizations or governments aiming to promote sustainable or pro-social consumer behavior?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And when we talk with our German counterparts on this project, so one example came with a retail chain in Germany that really cares about the environment, and they found that there's less now attention for some reason, maybe it's a cultural reason or maybe economic reason, something. So there's a drop in interest in in environmental attitudes and behaviors, and one of the potential intervention is to come up with an intervention that talks about how people around you actually care about the topic, and then see if this again increase environmental behavior, but even more importantly, increases the willingness of people to engage with others, to be what sometimes in the literature they call an ambassador for the topic. Um, at Northeastern, at my university, we are thinking about a field study that will collaborate with a local um, store. It could be so kind of on the beverage side, it could be Dunkin' Donuts, it could be Starbucks, where we would again create an intervention that not only lead people to bring their own cup or mug, so that's an environmental move, instead of getting, the plastic cups at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts. So bring their own cup, which will be an individual level behavior. But how can we create a test for that? They not only bring their own, but they convince others to bring their own. So we need to find a way, a creative way to do it. But then again, these are practical implication, a retail chain, or um, in the context of bringing your own mug, companies, brands that can make a change with the change in the type of interventions that they do. And I'll tell you, this is not easy because again, we're so used to think about the individual behavior. So we want the individual consumer to bring their own cup. That's it. This is where we stop. And we're saying, no, 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 no. This is important, but it's not enough. You need to add the extra and see if we're able to convince some of these individuals to also talk to somebody else and convince them. That would be a breakthrough because then the individual level start to move into a kind of more of a group level. So it's not only the individual. And when there's enough groups, enough individuals that make change, then, like we talked before, the norm gradually changes. Some of the institutions look at it and say, oh, I think people care about this topic. Let me weigh in. And then you have a systematic change at the end. But you have
Professor,
to move through
sure.
this I to G level, group level, and then only then system level.
Professor Amir, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, what future research directions or interdisciplinary collaborations do you see emerging from this framework?
So I would definitely see um, or think it's useful if there would be more field studies that would work with real clients, real cases. So not only controlled environment studies, these should be conducted ideally over time, so to see the dynamics. Um, I would still think there would be opportunities for people with expertise in different methods, so maybe the simulation ones, but combined with the experiment ones and in the lab and in the field, right? So a combination. I think there's more room for to study these type of interventions. Um, it's really just picking up this area. So it's an open question, what type of interventions can be useful to create those ambassadors, those people who care about the collective and are willing to talk with others. And I'm not talking about the activists. The activists are already engaged, they care passionately about a topic. I'm talking about the regular individual consumer. What will it take to convince them to talk with others, to share with others? Another kind of area of research might be um, not only the type of intervention in terms of, the communication, the messaging, the wording, this is important, but also what is it in the intervention that will allow, without talking to others, allow others to observe and see a change, right? Is it the fact that people I don't, so in the example of the mug, bring your own mug to Starbucks, to Dunkin' Donuts. Of course, one option is that I talk with somebody else and convince them to bring their cup. But what is the impact of other people just see me bringing a cup? How can we quantify this type of effects and dynamics? It's not easy. We would need a lot of creative thinking about these topics. But I think there's this big room, meaningful room for research and opportunities in that space. And it's very, I think, a valuable area, because if we're successful, then we are, making some progress on the opportunity to make system level change.
Thank you, Dr. Amir, for sharing your valuable insights on driving social change through consumer research. Your work offers a powerful perspective on how individual actions can collectively shape system level transformation. We appreciate your time and thoughtful discussion today. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.